Welcome to the Garden Podcast, sponsored by the Garden Worship Experience at San Dieguito United Methodist Church in Encinitas, California. My name is Faith Daniel. I'm the Director of Community Engagement, and my co-host is Mark Maddix, the lead pastor. We welcome you to the Garden Podcast. The goal of the Garden Podcast is to help people of faith think critically, love authentically, and serve compassionately.
We welcome today to our Garden Podcast Dr. Grace G. Sung Kim, Professor of Theology at Earlham School of Theology. She is a author, internationally known speaker, and has been very active in her involvement with the American Academy of Religion. She has authored over 24 books on constructive theology and Asian feminism and post-colonial theory. Welcome, Grace.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's such a joy and honor to be on. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. So thank you so
Yeah.
much.
And thank you. So today we plan to discuss Grace's new book, When God Became White, Dismantling Whiteness for a More Just Christianity. And so very interesting read and very timely read, I think, particularly in the context by which we find ourselves today. And thank you so much for your scholarship, the way that you're contributing to a very important discussion. And looking at the book and thinking through particularly the first part of it around your own journey, I thought maybe we'd just begin by asking you. It sounds like obviously this book has a very personal part of your own journey, particularly as a Korean immigrant. And maybe you share with us a little bit about that as you got into the conversation with the book.
Okay, thank you. Well, I was born in Korea and then we immigrated when I was 5 years old in 1975. And, as a child, being ridiculed for my ethnicity and the way I looked or talked or smell was such a huge burden, and it was very devastating for me growing up as an immigrant child. And so I took every opportunity to hide my ethnicity, though you can't do that. It's not like you can just take off your Koreanness. But I was always embarrassed about it. And it's only during my writing and my scholarship that I'm able to kind of retrieve and honor my ancestry. And there's a lot of wealth of words, vocabulary, concepts within Asia, and particularly Korean context. So, as a Korean American theologian, I use some of that. And so it's been a full kind of turnaround for me, not to be embarrassed about where I was born or how I became into the world, but to really embrace it. So I encourage everyone, if you're from a different area in the country or around the world, that we are all created in the image of God, and we need to embrace and celebrate our differences. So
Mhm.
I do share a lot of my history, my family, and my background. You've been a dean, so you understand, how classes work and
Right.
how students are in the classroom.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so when I teach theology, I always tell students that theology is biography, and biography becomes our theology.
Mhm.
So our stories are important, our experiences are crucial. Feminist theologians have shared that right from the beginning. And, theology is not a science. And so we come to know God from our personal experiences and our day-to-day living. So, we can't, as a pastor, bring God right into the sanctuary and share with everyone. We share it through stories, and that's what the Bible is. It's filled with stories of people turning away from God, encountering God, engaging with others on this faith journey. So that's how I began the book, and I'm hoping that those who read it will find it helpful. They're not going to resonate with all my stories, but hopefully it'll be a lens for them to understand their lives and their encounter with God.
Mm.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And And certainly, as a part of your narrative and journey, the book is about a white male God. And and certainly, as you tell about your own narrative and story, how has that impacted your life, your faith, and certainly it's been, I would think, very significant part of the shaping of who you are, but also how you spin that out in this book.
Well, until my adult life, I never questioned the God that I was taught, like who God is. So I grew up as an immigrant child, went to a Korean church, Korean Presbyterian church. But, my parents, my dad drove us around and we went to a lot of Baptist church and different churches. So I had a lot of church in my childhood and my youth. And they always, every church, the Korean church, they presented a white male God. And nobody questions it because it is, we just think Christianity is a white religion. When Christian missionaries came, they were all white. Missionaries either from US or Canada or from Europe into Korea, and they presented a white male God. So I never challenged it. I never questioned it. I just assumed that's who God is because that's the God that was taught to me in all the churches. And I grew up with that image, Walter Solomon's image that we're very familiar with, that I do talk about in the book. And in my 20s, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, they selected two students to go overseas for the summer. So my friend got selected to go to Nigeria, and I was selected to go to India. So this was in the 1990s, and I went to India. I was about 20 years old, and uh, everywhere I went, the churches and the schools all had that same image. And I thought, well, if it's all the way in India, this must be the true likeness of Jesus and God. We portray our image of who Jesus is unto God. And we know the progression of Jesus, who was born a Palestinian Jew. So if you've been to Israel and Palestine, you know that they are dark skin, olive skin, dark hair, dark eyebrows, and dark eyes, the indigenous people there. And so, how did Jesus become this light, fair-skinned European emperor or princely
Yeah.
looking? So there is reasons, and the book goes over that, and then we portray that onto God, and the book goes into more depth of, why God became this white male God and the need for a white male God by many white people around the world.
Mm,
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
yeah.
Yeah.
So there's so much misunderstanding today about how race is defined. Can you give us a brief description and how you view racism specifically as well?
Yeah, I think that's kind of like the core of the book. I wrote it because I was trying to understand why there is still so much racism 50 years after I immigrated. So
Mhm.
I understand in the 70s, people didn't quite understand or know anything about Koreans. And people all thought I was just making it up, that, there really wasn't a country named Korea. But now, 50 years later, there's K-beauty and, Korean beauty, and people are buying all these products. Or there's K-pop, all this Korean musicians
Yeah.
and singers, and BTS is,
Yeah.
they're selling probably more records than Taylor Swift. And so a worldwide phenomena.
Mhm.
Um, and then there's K-drama, which I love and I watch a lot of, and even Korean movies. Parasite won Best Picture a few years ago. So why is there so much racism still? So that's what drove me to write the book. I think people have a misunderstanding of what race is. People actually think, you know, how we understand race is biological. So some race is better than other race.
Mhm.
And so throughout history, it's white-skinned people that are better. And so during times of war, during World War II, some groups of people would measure people's brain sizes and say, some darker skinned people have smaller brain sizes, therefore they're inferior, they're barbaric. You can label all these things upon people that you don't like and you want to destroy or murder. So we looked at it as a very biological term, but it's really a sociological construct, and that will really help us to kind of fight this notion of racism that is so embedded in our society and in our churches. So during times of war, when they said, okay, Black people had smaller brain sizes, or, something's wrong with their bodies, you could eliminate them or enslave them. So we saw this against Jewish people during World War II, that they are less than people. So, the book covers this more in depth, and even the notion of how white people came about. We think that this was some ancient concept. It wasn't an ancient concept. It's really a modern
Mhm.
kind of understanding of white people and Black people.
Mhm.
For example, in Africa, I spoke at a conference, a Sojourners Conference many years ago, and many Africans will say, that they never viewed themselves as Black people until they came to North America and everybody told them that they were Black people.
Yeah.
You're
Mhm.
not born and thinking, oh, I'm a Black person. Just like Asians in Asia, we're not born and we think, oh, we're so yellow people and, we're yellow skinned people. We don't think that way. We just think of ourselves as human beings. We come to North America and everybody says, oh, you Asians are yellow people. So, this concept and how these terms are used, we really carefully have to understand and construct and deconstruct it. So, the book covers how white people came to be. So, it came, during the time of enslavement. So, the category used for African enslaved people here in the US, they were labeled as non-Christians, and the slave owners, the enslavers, were called Christians. So
Mhm.
that was a category used. So we use these categories throughout history, but most recently during the time of enslavement, that was a good category. The enslaved Africans weren't Christians, so you just called them non-Christians, and the enslavers most of them were Christians. So that became a good category to differentiate people, to categorize people, to say one group is better than the other,
Mhm.
until the enslaved people started to become Christians. So, the Methodists, from the North, and Quakers and other denominations, they started sharing the gospel to the enslaved. And some of them, converted. So when you got enslaved Africans becoming Christians, that category didn't work anymore because it messed everything up. So you couldn't say to Africans who were enslaved who converted to Christianity that they were non-Christians. So human beings, we need categories to differentiate one group from another. So when that category didn't work anymore, the category of Black people and white people, began, and it was a good category. So it happened even in Jamaica and other places where the enslaved people, it was a good way to differentiate. And so that category is a very recent category, Black people and white people. And we know that these categories are very loose, these terms.
Mhm.
And, in Europe, not every uh, European so-called white people were included. So the Germans weren't included, the Italians weren't included, the Irish weren't included, the Jewish people. So, this category is very loose.
Mhm.
That's the point. These categories are used and misused in different times, a period, to label people, to oppress people, to subordinate people. So even though the white people category wasn't this loose term, but slowly different groups of people got included. So that's to say, these aren't biological terms, and these are social constructs. And because it's a social construct and it's used to categorize people, to create a hierarchy of people, and we know that white people are at the top of the hierarchy and Black people are, it becomes this tool of racism. And it's systemic, it's embedded in our North American culture, and it's in our churches to say that white people, the white-skinned people, are at the top of the category. They're the smartest, they're the best, they're the most innovative, and the best human being on earth. And the darker the skin, the worse you are. So this notion of racism, people say, oh, it's not that bad. No, it is bad.
Yeah.
It leads to murder and to death. That's why we have Black Lives Matter. And that's why, Black people have, driving while Black, because they're arrested or they're murdered in
Right.
their own cars when it doesn't happen to other people. So, this notion of racism, people say it's not that bad, but it really is. It
Mhm.
has led to the genocide of Native Americans here on this soil, on this American soil, because we thought, the white people thought they're barbaric, they're dark skinned, they aren't intelligent. And that's where we have uh, the doctrine of discovery that I cover in the book.
Mhm.
And that led to the genocide, led to the enslavement of people. Their racism is devastating, and it has huge consequences. And the church has endorsed it in so many ways through the doctrine of discovery, manifest destiny, and the enslavement of Africans. We as Christians, the church, really need to deal with it. And so I know you are in the Methodist Church. So many Methodist churches have invited me to speak on this particular book, When God Became White, because Methodists as a denomination is really, really dealing and struggling with racism. And so I'm really happy that the Methodist churches are doing it. I feel like the Presbyterian churches need to, catch up to the Methodist church and really deal with it, because people think, oh, racism isn't bad. I always say the church has failed to call it a sin. We
Mhm.
need to call it a sin,
Right.
and the church needs to deal with it because it has led to so many problems in society and in the church. So I'm so glad that many Methodist churches are using it uh, in the church as a Bible study book, or different ways. So I'm thrilled, and I'm just honored to be on your podcast, because
Yeah.
even your church, um, uh, you know, putting racism at the forefront, and dealing with my book or other books,
Mhm.
it's a joy that your church and other Methodist churches are using it. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And certainly we're seeing some of this being played out right now, especially here along the border, right? What we're seeing
Yes.
to Hispanics and how they're being labeled in certain kinds of ways and dehumanizing them and shipping them off to other places. That this has kind of repeated throughout our history, right? I mean, in the war, certainly that happened to Asian Americans. They were in prison and camped and during those times. And so you're right. I mean, you think in some ways we've grown and we've moved beyond some of these things, but
Yeah.
we're finding that it's still deeply embedded in our culture, especially in our churches. And so, yeah, I agree with you that it's something we need to name. We need to name it. And
Uh-huh.
we also need to repent and recognize that we're all culpable in some ways because we're not giving attention or recognizing the fact that racism still is very much alive in so many different ways.
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning the um uh, the internment camps during the
Yeah,
war, because
yeah,
U.S. was not just in war with Japan; they were also in war with Italy and
right. Yeah,
Germany. But no Germans or Italians were rounded up; only the Japanese. So we see how racism gets played out through Congress, through laws, and what happens in society. So thank you for pointing that out.
yeah. So kind of continuing that conversation a bit, but your book really is kind of in some ways deconstructing this white God that you're talking about. And maybe just share with us, I know you do a lot of work in post-colonial studies and you've kind of articulated some of that already, but talk to us a little bit about the ways in which these theories have helped you in the process of thinking through this kind of deconstruction of a white God.
Yeah, that's a good question. I do have a chapter on missiology of whiteness,
Yeah.
looking at the Korean context in particular, but I think it was global, where whiteness was spread through white missionaries that went into Asia, South America, and Africa, and Australia. So when we see this, they brought a white male God and we embraced it. We just thought this is the only way to kind of welcome Christianity. They brought this white male God. And so there was no questioning, no challenge to this. And I don't even know if the white missionaries really understood the impact of bringing this white male God. I think it's most, with post-colonial theory and with the rise of liberation theology and feminist theology and Black theology that we're questioning this. Post-colonial theology and post-colonial studies is really just pushing us to deconstruct what has been given to us and how certain groups are viewed the other. So your listeners or your church members may be aware of the book Orientalism by Edward Said, who kind of made a huge impact on how we see the world and how even this notion of Orientalism, how the West views the East as the other, as feminine, as a child, as inferior. So that gets played in, and we wonder, well, why is this happening?
Mhm.
Well, when we think about the European power and their colonialism around the world, when they went to colonize India or Africa, they brought their white male god with them. And that instilled in the people that they are inferior because they have different gods or different spirituality or different ways of understanding religion. But how do we even know that God is white
Yeah.
or male? That is a constructed notion.
Mhm.
And it was a necessary notion if we study the history of Christianity. The emperor, the Roman emperor, under the Roman Empire, Christianity became the religion of the empire, and the emperor needed a god that looked like them, not a Palestinian looking god. So, we see this progression in European art where Jesus becomes more fair and fair as history goes by. Because if you're colonizing different parts of the world, you can't have a God that looks like the colonized people,
Yeah, exactly.
like the Muslims. You
Yeah.
can't.
Yeah.
And Jesus looked like a Muslim, probably.
Yeah.
But you can't have Jesus or God look like them because you're killing them.
Uh-huh.
After the Crusades, Christians killed so many Muslims. They took over their lands and they colonized. So you can't have a God that looks like the colonized people.
Right.
So, post-colonial theory is really challenging the ways we view the world and we view each other and how the other is created. So, the book goes into this, and I hope the readers will be challenged because until recently, we never challenged what the church was teaching us. And what the church was teaching us were all white male European theologians until very recently,
Right.
until white European women started to challenge it, and immigrant theology and other theology around the world, Latin American liberation theology. So, I don't expect the readers to just embrace everything. Well, that would be good,
Yeah.
but to be challenged by some of my questions. And, the book, every chapter ends with Q&A, so
Mhm.
questions.
Yeah.
And that I never did when I submitted it to the publisher, but the publisher thought this is a great book study.
Mhm.
So they made me, write in the questions when I thought the book was done.
Yeah.
But I think the readers find it really helpful, and they can expand on the questions and really have a deeper conversation. Of course, you could read it as an individual, but if you're doing it in faith communities or in church bodies, that the questions will really challenge you and help you deconstruct
Mhm.
what you were taught maybe in Sunday school or youth group or even as an adult, that the book will be a challenging book. Or maybe you already knew all this or already embraced it, then that will be wonderful. Use it
Yeah.
to teach others.
Yeah.
So there's many ways to use the book.
Yeah. Thank you. So, how might we work towards liberating whiteness, particularly when we're talking about a white Jesus?
Yeah, I think understanding that it's also a social construct
Mhm.
that upholds white supremacy and, this white hierarchy, that it is this created notion. So once we understand it's a created notion, just like what race is, then it becomes a really helpful way to kind of see the world. That, I give the example always when I speak on this book. As an Asian American immigrant here in North America, I have been labeled a minority. And I am. So there's about only 6.7% of Asian Americans living here in the US. Black people is about 14%, but we know that minority people are on the rise. I guess through more immigration or we just produce more babies. But the stats are saying that white people are going to be the minority soon. So, these terms that we use, but when we look globally, Asians, people are always surprised when I ask the group, what percent are Asians in the world? And the Asian percentage is 60% of the world population because we have China, we also have India, and they're like the two biggest countries. So when we look globally, I'm not a minority, I am the majority.
Right.
I am the majority of the world. So I think these categories and these terms need to be challenged. So in America, I don't want to be labeled a minority. I want to say I'm minoritized. I am made a minority. And these terms are used by white people to keep us in place that you're kind of at the bottom. So don't speak up. Your concepts aren't important. And this will happen in theology and within the church. You're just a minority. But to understand that I'm minoritized is very liberating. So, when we think about God and the need to have this white male God to legitimize white people's power and supremacy, if we unpack that and deconstruct it, we understand why this notion of whiteness applied upon God is necessary. But when white people aren't going to churches, the stats say the churches are rising in the global south. We really have to question this and understand how it's being used. So Mary Daly, an important feminist theologian who was made an outcast of the church, and she left the church eventually. She was a Catholic, but she left the church. She had this huge exodus happening in Boston in a church, and I think the seminary setting, and her and many feminist theologians and students left. So she made a big statement. And one of her important quotes is, if God is male, then the male is God.
Mm.
I would add, if God is white male, then the white male is God.
Mm. Yeah.
I think that's an important way to see what is happening in the church. The Catholic Church, they don't want to ordain women because they say men are closer to God. How do they know that they're closer to God? But anyway, that's the
Yeah.
argument.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the argument by white men is they are also closer to God and they represent God.
Mhm.
How do they know they are closer to God? And how do they know that they represent God? But that has been the narrative for a long time. So we have to really challenge that and deconstruct it. How do they know God is white when
Right.
nobody has seen God?
Right.
Yeah.
We we have created God in our own image.
Mhm.
Even though the Ten Commandments says do not do that, we have done that because it's been white male theologians, white male European leaders and ministers, and they have done that to legitimize their power.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So I think understanding how whiteness works and how that's tied to power becomes a good way for us to challenge this and deconstruct it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, thank you. And so maybe a final question, those who might be watching who are like us, we're white and particularly white males who may find themselves pushing against this a little bit, right? Because I'm sure you've experienced that. But what might be some practical ways in which um, those of us who are in this European white community, what might be some things that we could begin to not only become aware of, but what are some things we can be in tune to or attentive to so that we don't fall into the same kind of colonialistic understanding of God? How can we begin to be liberated from that ourselves and to begin to see God more broadly?
Yeah, that's a great way to end. And so I want to say a little bit about how patriarchy. So when feminist theologians are challenging patriarchy, some people thought, oh, then women hate men. That's not that's not the
Right.
case. We love men. I'm married to a man and I have two sons. It's not hating men, it's hating the system of patriarchy. And
Mhm.
in the same way, we're not, people of color are not saying we hate all white people.
Right.
It's not that. We hate the system of whiteness and racism that elevates white people over other people of color. So I hope the listeners are understanding the difference and how this works. And so, the book ends with different ways of viewing God because for me, I realize how we view God impacts how we behave and treat other people. So, for the 2,000 years of Christianity, we elevated a white male God. And so that has legitimized racism and sexism within society and within the church. So we know Christianity is dwindling in the US, but still Christianity has impacted culture and how lawmakers create law. So if Christianity has still a big impact and we uphold a white male God, that is going to impact how we create these laws in society, and we see the consequences even today. So, how we treat women and how we treat immigrants and refugees and people of color. Because, when we look at American history, it's not, this was inhabited for thousands of years by the Native Americans. But one of the earliest immigrants were actually the Filipinos who came 500 years ago. It's not the white people that came. So, understanding our history and understanding how this nation became white and whiteness kind of ruled this nation, it circles back to how we understand God. So we really need to unpack God. And the book kind of ends with the different ways that we can think about God that is within tradition and within the scripture. And so I think moving away from the white language that's so embedded in our liturgies, in our hymns, fair as white Jesus, or some a hymn like that. We have that washed in the blood of Christ, this whiteness is embedded. So I think, um, ministers and liturgists and hymn writers need to be challenged in the language that we use, the male language or the white language that is so embedded in our Christianity. And I think we also need white people to stand up and be in solidarity. We need white people to speak up and challenge this 2,000-year history of a white male God and say, maybe this isn't who God is. And so when the book was coming out, the book hadn't come out, but I was sharing the image on social media. So it says, when God became white. So nobody had read the book, and people were commenting and saying, oh, nasty comments.
Yeah.
It was actually white people who stood up for me. And
Mm.
that
Good.
really was so good,
Yeah.
saying, you haven't read the book. Why are you saying these
Yeah.
comments?
Yeah.
And how do you know that God is white and male? So we need white people to stand up and challenge and be in solidarity with people of color. So, there's a lot of things that need to be done. And I hope that many white people and people of color will read the book. I'm always so thankful when white people read it and they message me or reach out to me saying our whole church needs to read this or their family needs to read it. That is being in solidarity, saying it really challenged them and impacted them, and other white people need to read it. So, yeah, thank you for that final question. I hope that people in your church and your listeners will be challenged by the book and other authors who have written on such topics.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Grace, for joining us on our podcast. This podcast is sponsored by San Diego United Methodist Church and our new contemporary worship service called The Garden. The Garden
Oh,
is a safe, affirming, and inclusive space where people can explore faith and ask life's biggest questions.
Yeah, we
that
invite you
is
to check
great.
out the Garden Worship Service on Sunday mornings at 11 o'clock, and also our traditional worship service at 9:30 here in Encinitas, California. Not only in person, but you also can watch us live online. And you can visit our podcast at the Garden website, which is thegardenencinitas.org. Or you can listen to this podcast on Spotify, or you can also watch it on the YouTube channel. If the podcast is something that you resonated with, it was meaningful to you, is helpful to you, we just ask you to give us a thumbs up on the podcast. So thank you again for joining us, Grace.
Thank
And
you.
thanks for joining us in the Garden Podcast. We look forward to seeing those of you who watch us on a regular basis. Look forward to seeing you next time.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for